Hi everyone, and welcome to Bob's Wood Stuff. Today I'll walk you through my experience building a marking knife out of an old reciprocating saw blade. Let's go to the shop.
The first thing I did was grind off all of the teeth on my bench grinder. I frequently dip the blade into a glass of water so it doesn't get too hot and lose its hardness. Once the teeth were removed, I grinded the other side of the blade to make the tip into a sharp point. Using my machinist vise, I squeezed the part of the blade that had teeth on it because it has a wavy texture which I'm trying to flatten. The tip of the blade is still slightly bent, so I'm going to hammer it until it gets straight. This is called cold forging. I don't want to move my anvil, so I'm using this exercise weight as an anvil. It's still not quite straight, so I elevated part of it with a piece of paper and hammered it, and that made it straight. I lapped the blade on some 80 grit sandpaper adhered to a piece of glass to get all the paint off of it. Then I flipped it to the 220 grit sandpaper and did the same thing. The scrap of Purple Heart I had looked like a pretty good size for the handle, so I decided to use that species. I cut it to length on the bandsaw, making it about 6 inches longer than I want the handle. And then I resawed it to the approximate thickness that I want. Then I marked how far into the handle I want the blade to go, and cut a kerf on the bandsaw using a fence. I put the blade back in my machinist vise and used a file to score a line where I could snap it off. It snaps pretty easily, so I know the steel is still hardened. If it doesn't snap when you do this, the steel might not be hardened anymore. Then I cleaned up the edge on my bench grinder, and also ground down some raised areas that would make it too wide for the kerf that I cut. I did some initial shaping on my belt sander, thinking about which parts would be difficult to shape after attaching the blade. I mixed some 5-minute 2-part epoxy, put it all over the blade, and then put the blade into the saw kerf. Then added some clamps for good measure. Once the epoxy had cured, I tried to drill 2 holes in the handle to put pins through the blade, but I was unsuccessful at drilling through the hardened steel. If anyone has any tips on drilling through hardened steel, please leave them in the comments. I did some initial shaping with a file, just trying to round off all the sharp corners. I held the marking knife the way I would when using it, and marked with a pencil where my fingers rub on the handle. Then I filed those areas down with the round side of my file. I repeated the process for my thumb and my hand and my index finger until it became very comfortable and ergonomic. Then I used a sanding spindle in my handheld drill. I made the sanding spindle by adhering 220 grit sandpaper to a wooden dowel that fits inside my drill chuck. Then I switched to a store-bought sanding spindle that was slightly wider and slightly softer than the one that I had made. This allowed me to smooth out the handle and get rid of some of the marks from the file. I cut the handle to its final length on the bandsaw, putting an angle on the end just for style. Then I filed down the edge so it looked nice. I got distracted by this hummingbird that flew into my shop and got caught in a spider web in my skylight. I tried to scare it out the front door with some compressed air, but eventually it found the way out on its own. Then I used an extra fine foam sanding block to smooth out the whole handle. This works very well because the foam contours to the shape. I cleaned off the handle with some denatured alcohol, and then applied one layer of tung oil finish and let it sit for 5 minutes before wiping it off. Then I went to my diamond stones to establish a bevel on the blade and flatten out the back. I started with the 120 grit diamond stone and worked my way all the way up to 6,000 grit. And by the end, the marking knife was very sharp. It turned out to be a really good marking knife. It's very comfortable in my hand, and having a bevel on just one side makes it work really well for marking layout lines with a ruler. For future marking knives, I would make it the same way, except I would like to put some pins in the handle, and I would file one of these notches into the blade before sharpening it to make it easier to establish a bevel. Thanks for watching everyone, and be sure to subscribe for other videos.